Today is April 24th, 2023. My name is Tony Venheisen. We are recording an oral history interview for the South Dakota State Historical Society. You are Mark Mickelson. Can you state your full name and spell it, please?
G. Mark Mickelson, MarkMickelson.
Very good. And we have permission to record this interview?
You do?
All right. Let's start with you, kind of your early life. When and where were you born? Talk about your childhood, your family growing up.
Well, I was born in Fort Knox, Kentucky. My dad was on a Vietnam commitment in 1966. My folks, as a young married couple, lived a couple different places before they moved back to Sioux Falls or back to South Dakota when I was about 2.
Your dad was in Vietnam when you were born?
I think he might have been. Yeah. There's certain self-administered health deals that my mom we used to tell, but I don't know that for sure.
Yeah.
March 27, 66. But my dad needed a job when he was graduated. I think his dad had died about the time I was born, who was a prominent, a governor and a federal judge, and so he got a job in Pierre doing South Dakota, doing condemnations for DOT when they were building the dams. So they were doing all that condemnation work.
And like out of law school.
Well, he was out of Vietnam and he needed to get hooked up with a firm.
Right.
And these, obviously, I know they had a house. Pat and Tom Adam, of course, his sister were great friends, and I've heard stories of the house that had no air conditioning. And then a guy kind of heard. Someone told Bill McCann, a prominent lawyer in Brookings, that, hey, you ought to talk to this young Mickelson. He'd be a good lawyer for you. And so my folks looked at moving to either Parker or Brookings. And they chose Brookings. They didn't want to come to Sioux Falls because all the grandparents were here. So they wanted I think they wanted a little separation. And it turned out to be a great choice and a great community. And my dad was... always had that kind of a personality where he was just great friend and a great guy and worked hard and was good at what he did. And, he became fast friends with many people in Brookings, in fact. And so I grew up, he was a leading member of the community as a lawyer, and did 6 years in the state in the state house when it's 74 to 80. I was born in 66, so 8 through 14, we'd take the bus out, spend a week, see our cousins, throw snowballs out the windows at people out of the speaker's office when he was speakers. Carl and I would, and just kind of
Carl Adam.
Yeah, Carl Adam, yeah. And but just had it was just kind of part of the deal. He would, and then I remember going to those committee meetings with him when he was a legislator. Dusty, just hot and dusty upstairs in those unfinished committee rooms, and I would be, laying on a bench or just waiting for this terribly dreary meeting to get over. But kind of how we grew up.
You remember some of the other legislators you served with?
Well, sure. John Bibby was the senior member of that delegation out of Brookings, just a peach of a guy. Mary, whose husband went on to be Mary Wagner, was a peer. He would pick her up and take her to Pierre every week. When they'd make that commute. Jerry Lammers out of Madison, Walt Miller. His seatmate was a guy named Neil Clark. If you remember Neil, had a sign business here in Sioux Falls. Was married to Pat Clark. George Shannard was of that vintage. Deborah Anderson, if you remember Deborah.
Just died?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, it was a going deal. Janklow was governor, or at least, I don't remember when the Knight would have been the front half of that, but I remember at the end, they were all really excited. I must have been there for the State of the State, but, he's coming in, and I go, well, who is this guy? He's 38 years old, and he's got braces on, because Janklow just gotten braces at age 38. But there was a lot of excitement here. I think Janklow was kind of that just created excitement.
Republicans had taken back over.
Yeah.
I want to go back a little bit. You've told me before about your grandma Mickelson, Madge. Can you talk about her a little bit? She had kind of an interesting story.
Well, my dad's side of the family came from Walworth County. I think Selby's the county seat, Mulbridge is the big town, north central South Dakota, and they were Germans, and they were out of Newton, Iowa. Her side was, and she ended up marrying the kid who kind of grew up on the adjoining quarter. I mean, your worlds got pretty small, but what was in common about both of them was they both went to college. And women, I mean, particularly 1918, 1920, whenever this was very uncommon for women to go to college, but she was a renowned track athlete, lays claim to a national javelin throwing title, really all while smoking cigarettes. I mean, it was, it was kind of back when people smoked, and but she was a wonderful woman, and
Lived to be very old, didn't she?
yeah, lived to be 100, 101, and just kind of took every day in stride. She just didn't get too ruffled and just keep putting one foot right in front of the other, but was happy and determined and loving. Yeah.
Okay, so going back to the 70s then, you said you were about 8 when your dad got elected to the legislature, 14 or so when he left. So you went and visited him, you wouldn't have been real involved in that. But then going ahead to when he's looking at running for governor now, kind of in the 84, 85 time frame, you'd have been a little older, like what?
Senior in high school,
Yeah.
freshman in college, sophomore.
What do you remember, like was he always thinking of running for governor, or how did that come about, and when did he really start on that?
I'm going to take a drink.
And you don't need to look at me, Mark.
So, he just wanted to do something of significance. If I were to, my evaluation of him, and he'd done everything he was going to do as a private practice lawyer in Brookings. He had the banks and the city and the college, and he had his legal accounts, and I think that got to be a little repetitive. I'm imagining for him, and so, I think people would say he was always going to run for governor, and there's a story. There's a great story about this. When Bill Janklow was remodeling the old governor's mansion, when he got elected governor, there was a room you'd come in, it was off the left, and there was a piano that sat there. When they remodeled this room, there was a loose floor tile. And they dug up the floor tile, and there was a note that my father had written when he was 6 years old, 8 years old. It said, "I'll be back someday." That was really cool. And I heard that story from Bill Janklow, not from my dad. And then Bill sent that to my dad. Of course, my dad would have never mentioned that. So the part of him always wanted to be governor. Yeah, for sure. There was also the time that he sat us all down to tell us that he'd put his name in to become a federal judge. This is about 1980. And, he was like, "Hey, I want to go do something."
And his dad had been a federal judge.
Dad had been a federal judge, and it was a way to a new set of challenges, really, right? And so he didn't get picked. It was Abner's pick, and Judge Jones from Jones County, Lyman County, was picked. And I think Dad just, okay. And so he knew, he was at that point where he'd done the legislature, the House for 6 years, and he's like, okay, I'm not going to keep doing this. I want to run for governor. Janklow just got elected in 78, so Walt Miller, after my dad died, Walt Miller took over for my dad, was lieutenant governor and became governor. And he told a story about how when my dad was a legislator, Walt Miller was a friend of his, became his good friend of his, and my dad went to Walt and said, I think I might run for governor. And Walt says, well, you better walk down to the Attorney General's office and talk to him because I think Jankel's going to run. So my dad didn't run.
Well, this was in '78.
Yeah, this was the first time around.
Okay.
Yeah, just you'll love the aggression of these guys. And so Dad didn't run, and obviously, and this is from Walt. You know, this is all not things my dad would have shared, but this is kind of what Walt told after my dad passed. And then what I do know is that Jankel then asked my father to consider running as his lieutenant governor.
Oh.
And my dad, said, well, I don't know what he just said, probably doesn't suit my personality, I assume. And so he passed on that opportunity and waited kind of 6 years from 1980 when he was done in the legislature till 86 when that election was. And I think he probably declared in 84 to run.
I know what I've understood is he started pretty early relative to what was normal or what the others did.
There was a radio station report out of Sisseton. Was kind of the first time that there was a public report that my dad had said in public. My name's George Mickelson. I'm running for governor. So, it's something in sometime in 84.
And he probably wouldn't have been considered the front runner in that primary.
Well, maybe he wanted to paint himself as the underdog, but he had the sitting lieutenant governor from Sioux Falls, Lowell Hanson. He had the West River congressman who had been defeated when we got consolidated into one district, Clint Roberts, by Tom Daschle. Then he had Alice Kundert, the sitting Secretary of State, all kind of from different areas with different strengths with the voters. They all had their areas of allegiance. And he told his supporters, he went out and took a poll. And his line at the time was, well, I'm at 9%. And he said his pollster told him, well, half those people are thinking you're your dad. But he goes, I want you to know a corpse would poll at 12%. He used to tell that. I think he was trying to set his voters' expectations or his supporters' expectations. So he had to work hard. Yeah.
And you'd have been kind of out of high school, college age when he was running. So what was your role on his campaign for governor?
Well, I'd go with him, keep him company. One summer, my job was to be the driver. That must have been the summer between the primary and the general. But it was always easier to have, and I loved my dad and just loved being with him. And you'd show up and give a speech at the Rotary Club in Webster, and you'd have a kid in the back. I mean, that's good politics. And so, I listened to him give his. I'd stand in the back, and I'd say, "Hey, 9 minutes is all they've want to listen to you," and I'd stand in the back and give the old stop. It's been 9 minutes, Dad. And of course, I didn't really slow him down much, but it was fun. Yeah, so I was very involved as a family member. No way was I professional. They hand me a notebook and a pen and say, "Well, write down follow-up stuff." Well, I wasn't very good at that stuff, but I was good at keeping him company and driving, and he would sit next, we'd be driving, and he would get out his dictaphone and dictate, because that's how he wrote, as a lawyer. And so he'd have all these thank you notes, and on the drive home, he would be dictating all of his thank yous and everything, and then he'd hand it to Barb when he got back to the office, and kind of just was always very efficient that way. But my favorite story, he stopped. We'd go. That was the year of the centennials, so there were a lot of centennial parades going on at these cities. These small towns would turn 100. And, we were up in Eureka, where Melhoff's Cafe was. I think that was Eureka. Mike and Lori Melhoff owned a cafe, and it was raining on Main Street. And Dad had this conversion van with a trailer hitch on it. And there was only because it was raining, there was only two other cars on Main Street. But he said, "Why don't you go pull the car around in the rain from the other side and get close to the door?" So during the course of that process, trying to get as close to the front door as I could, I managed to put the trailer hitch of the conversion van through the bug shield of the only other car on that side of the street on Main Street. And he comes out here and he looks at me, he goes, so turns out it's a waitress's car that works at Melhoff's. And so he sat down, and gave him his name and address, and they sent him the bill was $115.63 or something like that. And so he sent him a check, and he found out from Mike Melhoff later that swung 7 votes from Clint Roberts to him, because she and all of her family were going to vote for Clint until they met him, and they liked him so much they all decided. I said, the way that all worked out, I said, that was your cheapest 7 votes right there.
That's funny. So I'm curious too, he goes through the primary. Did he pick Walter Dale as his running mate after the primary?
Before.
And how was that?
I think it was before, I should say, Tony. I was there. I mean,
how was that decision made, or did he consider
politics and friendship? He and Walt were close. Walt was a 25 year legislator. One of these guys, and the speaker used to come in, and those were 2-year terms, and so the House Majority Leader could be 10, 15 years, and they would trade that back and forth, but there was an old guard, and Walt was the old guard, and Dad was one of the young bucks, and Joe Barnett was a buddy of his, and so he had some friends, and he and Walt, I think, were friends, and he wanted Walt to support him openly in this primary, because Clint was quite strong out west, and he went and met with him at a downtown Rapid City cafe, and he says, well, drop me off, go park the car, and he was going to have coffee with Walt. Well, I didn't want to miss out on what was going to happen. So, I parked that car and got inside, and he basically asked Walt to be his running mate. And Walt said yes. And I think it was before the primary.
What about, so his opponent in the election then was Lars Herseth, whose dad had also been the governor.
Yep.
What do you remember about that fall campaign? And really was only 10,000 votes or so, pretty competitive election relative to a lot of them we've had.
Well, it was really close. It was kind of the time of, there was a farm crisis, there was a drought, and yields were poor, and interest rates were high, and there was a real farm crisis going on. And Reagan had done something as president to not help the ranchers with any sort of drought relief. He was just starting to get I remember there was an Iran-Contra controversy with a guy named Oliver North that was creating some blowback on Reagan and the national and just the general popularity of the Republican Party. And so I remember that Reagan came to Sioux Falls and stood on stage to have a rally for Abner. And Abner stayed in D.C. and didn't come back because that's how tenuous the support was for the national party. And Dad's race went from, his polling had him up comfortably.
Here, let's pause. Do we know why that's going on?
I do not know.
That happened this morning once too. Did they do something, or did it just stop after a minute?
I never heard what it is. It happens a couple times.
Let's just wait a second.
Yeah, we'll see if it stops.
That happened this morning too.
My dad's race against Lars, Lars was a very strong candidate. He had a lot of support. He was, I think, as you had to be at that time, a more mainstream candidate. They both were. And had been a long-time state legislative leader. There was the Republican ticket that year. Roger Tellinghusen was the AG candidate. And I'm going to say Roger won with 56, okay? Kind of your generic. My dad won with 52. Abner got beat with 45. Dale Bell got smoked by Tim Johnson. And that whole ticket, what my dad's polling showed in that last few weeks ahead of that election, the whole ticket fell about 10%. It had things to do, drought, lack of a federal relief program for the cattle guys out west dealing with the drought. Reagan was in trouble a little bit on the Iran-Contra issue, and so it was a time of maybe more even political parties at that time.
Yeah, I know I've heard before that, well, really what you just said, that last month of that campaign, Herseth kind of had a surge from earlier.
He did, yep. And one of the things I've since learned, one of the things about having, such a great legacy, and I mean, you get to learn a lot about your dad afterwards, but one of the things that he did, he won that race in Sioux Falls, Pierre, and Rapid City. There were other counties he won, probably Davison, and maybe a Yankton and a Union and Brookings. That's about it. But the vote totals that were significant were Minnehaha, Lincoln, Hughes, Pennington, where he, frankly, just got really organized. He had a very, very organized campaign, door to door. He outworked them. I mean, he would work as hard as he said. I'm not going to be outworked on this race. That was his motto. So I'm not going to lose because I got outworked. And so he just outworked or worked as hard as any of the other candidates, the primary and the general. And fortunately, that paid off. He had volunteers. You remember his sister, Jan Mickelson Carmody. Carmody's a very well-regarded family. And he had a core of support in Sioux Falls because he had attended high school here. A lot of the business community leaders, many of them, one of his very good friends, Sid Bostic from Brookings, was a leader in this business community. Tom Graham, who now married to my mom, Steve Egger, some real prominent people that were supporting my dad and helping him. And then Jan and some other ladies, his sister, they had dozens and dozens and dozens of legitimate volunteer block walkers. Okay, like they went out with their kids and knocked on doors and handed pamphlets and spread the word. And these were housewives, and I mean, these were not college kids. So
It's hard to get people to do that.
they won't do it anymore.
No.
Yeah, it's a different time. My dad had done the same thing in Brookings for others. I remember him doing it for Pressler. I was walking around knocking on doors for Pressler. I mean, it was a different time. Now we can text it or tweet it and think we've done our job.
Right. So he takes office in '87. You would have been in college. So you finished high school in Brookings, right?
Yep.
You'd be back there on weekends or something, but you never really lived in Pierre in the Governor's Mansion full time.
I didn't.
Your
No.
brother and sister, did they go to Pierre at all, or were they?
So Dave's a Pierre kid.
Okay,
Yeah.
How much younger is he than you?
Six years. Yeah, and Amy's a Brookings gal.
So she finished in Brookings.
Yeah, she had some summers in Pierre. I really didn't.
Yeah.
But she had summers in Pierre, but she was a Brookings High grad.
Yeah. Okay. So how aware day to day were you of him as governor? What's going on? What is he trying to do with the legislature? Did you follow that real closely, or were you kind of?
I didn't. I was very tuned into the campaign issues and what he would tell people he wanted to accomplish. Economic development, keeping our young people here, improving wages, improving economic opportunity, diversifying the economy, value-added agriculture, water issues, then and now, but water issues were huge. Tourism was a big deal out west, which he just had a natural affinity for. But those were his themes. He talked a lot about medical malpractice reform. He had a lot of support from the medical community. He was a lawyer, but he was, I guess, probably for capping. He wasn't probably. He was for. They capped medical malpractice damages and just kind of more business-friendly type legislation. So as a junior in college, my big issue in that campaign when I was, I was 18, they changed the drinking age to 19. Then I was 19, they changed the drinking age to 21. And, he was, his line on the campaign stump was, we'll just, I'm going to support what the law is. And I've seen some of his quotes about South Dakota v. Dole and how he South Dakota got held hostage, but on changing the drinking age. But those were his campaign themes. And then he does all this work and he barely gets elected, and he had a very good advisor Paul Wilson, who was young, trying to make his mark, statewide race, guy that started out last. And Paul and he sit down, and they came up with this idea of raising taxes right out of the gates. And so they passed the 1 cent temporary sales tax temporarily to create a low-interest loan fund to try to recruit industry here at a time when low-interest loans mattered. Your alternative was 10 or 12%, so 3% money it recruited a lot of industry, including John Calvin, a very well-renowned Watertown businessman who relocated his business, I think, from Hutchinson, Minnesota, was the first ready loan recipient. I can remember my college roommate, his dad had the Globe Clothiers over in Yankton, and he had to change their cash registers to figure out how to collect this extra penny. There was a little squawking going on in my fraternity house, but they got through it. Yeah. So, yeah, I wasn't, I went to the inaugural the first year, the first time he got elected. Not sure I was at the State of the State. Probably not. Probably back in college. Don't remember. And then when I graduated, Pierre I was not connected to. The thing I marvel about my dad, and frankly, Janko did the same thing in retrospect. I didn't, both of these guys, they sold their house. I mean, my dad packed his crap. He was so excited when he got elected governor. I can remember coming home for Thanksgiving from college, and he is packing my mom's dishes. And he is so excited to get moved to Pierre, and he couldn't afford to, I can't afford to have a house in Brookings. You didn't pay our governors a lot then or now. And so he'd sold his house, so he didn't have an escape hatch to come back to, and he sold the house in Brookings, and my cousin was one of my best friends, Carl Adam in Pierre, and spent half a summer in Pierre. But then when I graduated from college, kind of consistent with his theme was, I ended up taking a job in Minneapolis, paying 50% more than the comparable job in Sioux Falls as an accountant. And then I spent a couple of years doing that. Spent 3 years in law school, so I was out of state when he was in office mostly.
So you finished college in what, 88?
Yeah.
And then you were in cities for a couple of years, then went to law school at Harvard.
I did.
And you finished when?
93. Yeah, he died in April. I graduated in June.
Okay. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Mom and Dad had just gotten back they'd begun an annual trip to the Masters with the governor of Georgia, and Dad was getting them on some pheasant hunting, and they just Mom loved to golf, and kind of an annual trip of theirs just ahead of that. And I get a call. Some friends and I had run the Boston Marathon as unofficial entrants that day, and just got a call from my Uncle Tom, who was my dad's closest political confidant, Tom Adam, Dad's brother-in-law, in Pierre, and just said, your mom needs to talk to you. There's been an accident. And they found, and I was just stunned, wiped out, obviously. And it was when, you always read about bad things happening to other people. And it's really strange when it shows up on your door. But he'd have been happy and proud of how I think his family just kind of persevered right through it. He didn't have it kind of like Madge would have said, his mom. It's bad luck. Bad luck for a lot of people. But he died loving what he was doing. He got a lot out of his life. It wasn't always all about the length, but he maximized his time and his efforts, and he'd take chances, and he loved, which is why I, biased, but he was really good at it because he just loved being governor.
So then did you fly home that same day, or how did that all go?
Bill Janklow called Mike Werdeman, Rapid City area businessman, and Mike And then his friend of mine, Bill's son Russ, got on that plane the next day and flew out and got me. That was very nice of him. So I slept that day. I'd run the marathon, so I was pretty wiped out. And the next day came home, and we spent a week, kind of just as a family there with my brother, my sister, my mom, and Tom, Adam, figuring out what to do. How do you plan the service and where do you have it? And fortunately, Mom, I think Walt got sworn in, and Mom stayed in the mansion for a month or two and then just rented a house in Pierre for a year until she figured out what she was going to do next.
Well, I didn't realize she stayed in Pierre.
She didn't have a house. And you got to just put reality,
Yeah.
It's like she didn't have a house to go to. She's a strong woman too to get through that and say, okay, well, I'm just going to rent a house. She didn't know where she was going to go. She had some ideas, but she didn't want to rush into anything until she'd kind of had some time. And so Amy was in Vermilion at college. Dave was in college at Spearfish. I had just moved to Sioux Falls for work. So we were around, and she ended up buying a home in Sioux Falls. And a year later moved down here and began kind of her new life.
Yeah, we should talk about her a little more because I kind of get lost in the shuffle. But she was a McCarran, your mom. Can you talk a little about that family?
Well, they met in the 8th grade. I don't know how long it took until they started going steady, but somewhere along the line, she was a Pi Phi. They were Washington high school classmates. I think sweethearts, very big class. Washington high school is the only high school, so they were, I think, kind of pretty prominent members of their high school community, and both went to USD. Frankly, their undergraduate class would have been smaller than their high school class at the time, and they would have grown up. Well, they grew up. So she grew up. Mom, Linda McCarran, grew up in Sioux Falls. She was the youngest of 3, and got married right out of college. Because Mom taught down at Jefferson High School. Well, then Dad went to law school. That was back on the 3-and-3 program when you go 3 years undergrad, 3 years law school. So the McCarran family was great USD people, and just like the Mickelsons were and are. So, it was a great marriage. Yeah.
She was a pretty active first lady too, from my impression isn't that true?
Well, there was a lot of mutual respect, and so, but she was kind of just unqualified, always for him, and he knew that being governor and first lady really wasn't her first choice. She'd have been pretty happy playing golf in Brookings and, going to Phoenix in the winter. And but she said, well, if this is really what you want to do, I'll support it. And then she embraced it wholeheartedly. Mom carries herself really well, very bright. They both were very bright, and both had very high energy levels. And both are very engaging, very social. Both youngest kids, so there was, they both had kind of that, I don't know if you're the youngest or the oldest, but, the youngest kid kind of just gets that unconditional love at the end. You're kind of giving up on trying to correct all the misbehaviors or whatever, but they both turned out great.
Who were your dad's kind of inner circle friends, advisors? I mean, you've mentioned Tom Adam a couple times, but when he was governor, who would that have been?
Well, clearly Tom Adam, longtime leading lobbyist attorney in Pierre, whose wife, Pat, she was the daughter of a governor. They had a view of statewide politics and policy, very well regarded. He was, in politics, you're never quite sure when they're for you and when they're just telling you they're for you. And with Tom, he was always for you, So, I mean, there was no questions there. So while he was in office, I would have to say Tom. And then as I wasn't around much of the time that he was governor, kind of on the way to get there, Sid Bostic, who ran Sioux Falls, what at the time was Norwest Bank, had come out of Brookings, had run the bank. They grew up as peers in the Brookings business community, just and very bright and successful and had a view. Well, I'd put Walter Miller into that conversation. I think Walt, 25, 30 years in the legislature as lieutenant governor, had an active role. I don't think the lieutenant governor had been full-time, became full-time, I think, under Walt. But that worked both ways. It was a nice job for Walt, but Walt brought a lot to the table. Many others. Rich Helsper was a law partner of his who was just around a lot and loved my dad. And, when my dad decided to run for governor, I can remember let's say it's 84, out at Lake Campbell by the golf course in Brookings, his buddies get up and present him a check for $55,000 from 55 different couples in Brookings, South Dakota in 1984, 85. I mean, that was just incredible. I was just, they knew he couldn't afford not to get paid to take a year off and run, or a year and a half off and run for governor, that he needed to have an income source. And so they said, well, we'll back you.
Frank Bross was his chief of staff.
Yeah, and Frank would have been, huge, especially out west, But Frank, and how lucky are you to get a guy like Frank Bross to agree to give up your law practice and turn over the cattle ranch to someone else and move, your family to Pierre, when these kids are in school, who's, very bright and very successful professionally, knows the state, knows the political issues, has been involved in political campaigns and activities his whole life. We didn't go to any parades and press shows, so, I never got to stop to see Frank on the,
We talked to Frank this morning, so
it's just, you marvel at people who, sell their house and these guys are in the prime of their life, 45 years old, and just pitching it all in, and it's great.
That was interesting because he kind of, in a way, kind of understated or underplayed that. Like, well, I was looking for something new to do anyway. Like, it wasn't that big of a deal, but it's really, it's a pretty big upheaval in your life when you're.
It's one of those deals where it was
years old.
probably a good fit, like most good things are, most good relationships. But you know what? It was also a new set of challenges for Frank. And Frank knew that, he wasn't the kind of guy that wasn't not going to be listened to, It's not like Frank wouldn't have been there shaping the policy right with my dad and participating in that give and take of formulating, well, this is what we should do, or that is what we should do. So I'm sure it was a rewarding experience for Frank. Obviously he looks back on it, very fondly.
He said, I'm sure you know this, but he was talking about the fact that he was just about to leave the governor's office at the time that your dad died, that end of that month, and that Dean Crowwood was going to take over. But we're talking to Dean tomorrow. I wonder if you have anything to say about him.
Yeah, well, Dean, there's another. My dad had a lot of good friends, and Dean was a neighbor, probably before he was a friend, and a guy who was in the South Dakota State College Hall of Fame. He's a baseball player, had a Twins minor league contract. A lot of fun, and I'd recruited my dad to his softball team. They're just buddies, and Dean had the itch. Don't know when he ran for the legislature, but he was a legislator in 82, 84, 86, about the time my dad was running, I suppose. And yeah, maybe I met maybe almost a little bit like a big brother, little brother relationship. There was enough of an age difference there. But yeah, Dean, and I think Dean had a political interest in seeing what else might be out there for him.
We talked this morning about if your dad hadn't died, if Walt hadn't had to step in, who was looking at running for governor then in '94?
Janko. That didn't change.
Yeah.
I think Janko had a letter that he says my dad wrote him. If you remember that campaign. But I think that, from what Bill said, I would believe it. I don't know this, but Dad wrote him a letter saying you need to run for governor when I'm done. So there was two giants there in my view, and a lot of mutual respect and admiration, and appreciated what each of them were trying to do. Wasn't always popular, but they were. One thing you knew about both of them is they were always doing what they thought was right.
And Janko had kind of helped your dad along, hadn't he, when he was running and looking at running? And
I think so. That would have been done quietly, because his lieutenant governor was running, and I think some of those folks in that Janko administration were supporting the lieutenant governor, Lil Hansen. But I suspect Bill was for my dad, but it maybe had to do it a little bit more quietly. There was, I don't know, no open published endorsement or anything like that.
Do you have any idea what your dad's plans would have been when he left office? There was always talk he was going to run against Pressler. Is that something that...
I don't know that. Yeah, it's idle speculation.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. He's not alive.
Well, let's talk about you for a minute. So, you come back to Sioux Falls in 4?
3.
Later, after law school in 93. Kind of just take a minute, you don't have to go into a lot of detail, but kind of talk through what you've done since then and what your professional career has been.
Well, I earned my CPA, worked for a couple years in Minneapolis, went to law school at Harvard. Well, wasn't sure I really wanted to practice law. More interested in a business career, a commercial career, and I decided that I wanted to come back to this region. Minneapolis I liked when I lived there, Sioux Falls, and met a gentleman at a governor's hunt, told him I was looking around. A friend of mine here in town connected me, and ended up coming to work in a finance role for a local real estate firm. And one of our investors was a public utility, Northwestern Public Service, worked for them for 6 or 7 years. I learned quite a bit because a lot of what they did didn't work. They ultimately filed bankruptcy. And then out of that experience, kind of really set myself up to work for myself. And I've got today done transactional advisory work, financial in nature, where I'm a consultant, arranger, broker, but we have a niche practice in the railroad industry with a lot of little railroads all over the country, and it's been fun, and we hope to continue. It's a small firm, but with a nice product line, so it's a nice little business, and it's gotten me around the country. And one of the things I like doing is learning, and so it doesn't really even matter what it is. So I've just learned a lot about the industrial economy and all those kinds of things. And I always had thought, one of the things when my dad was running for governor, I thought, well, this is great, except now I'm going to have to do it because his dad had done it. I can remember way back. And so I started, I said, well, I'll just put that off. I'll go make my mark. And I just kind of kept kicking because it wasn't really the burn I had in my gut, like you got to have it. And but Janko dies sitting at a basketball game down at Dakota Dunes, watching one of my kids, you know, in a gym down there, 10 or 12-year-old basketball. And Ryan Nelson, friend of mine, John Thune's chief, and I are just sitting. And I'm like, I voiced this out loud to him. I said, I'm thinking maybe I should run, you know, for the legislature, the House, just to see. He goes, you should. So I didn't know how to do it. I just went down and got a petition and filled it out and ran for and so I ended up serving 6 years in the South Dakota House, 2 years as Speaker, which of course my dad and my grandfather had both done, and then CEO Marty Jackley is starting to run for governor, and boy, if I'm going to run, I mean, this is my window, you know, and so I started running financially and going to these Lincoln Day dinners, but I didn't enjoy it, and so I just
$1 million, didn't you?
yeah, quite a bit. Money was not going to be my problem, you know. The business community, I was fortunate to have good support. Sioux Falls, and it doesn't matter because I didn't run, but I would have loved, like I think I actually would love being governor. Like I think that'd be fun to at least. There are parts of the job that would be fun. You know, there's always the other parts that aren't that much fun. But I don't think, for me, kind of my analysis on reflection was, just don't think I really wanted it bad enough to put up with all of the unattractive elements of kind of doing it. And I'm sure everyone goes through that. So far, you know, haven't looked back at that decision with any regret. You know, I don't think that'll change. You know, your perspective can change with time, and so I'm aware of that. And one of my personality traits is I'm also very achievement oriented and and I like to be productive. And so, as you know, Tony, politics can be a difficult business to measure accomplishment in, and I struggled with that because really all they do is they measure. That's not fair. But you measure productivity on how much money you raise. Well, that's not really, that's just part of it. I mean, but it's hard to measure accomplishment, but so, yeah.
Really though, you didn't run for governor, but your record of in the legislature and then the work you've done outside the legislature is a lot of the same issues your dad worked on, aren't they? When you think about ag development, technical education, you know, workforce, economic development, it's a lot of the same things, isn't it?
Well, those were the themes that are in my DNA. You know, this guy I worshipped, believed in it. So that's what I believe.